Hello friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel, that is ENT Chronicle, and today the topic of discussion is physiology of the nose. So what functions does the nose play? One of the most important function of nose is sense of smelling, referred to as olfaction. Then nose is also responsible for inspiration and expiration, together known as the respiration. Nose also helps in the air conditioning of the inspired air. It maintains the humidity and temperature of the inspired air. Nose is also involved in protection of the lower airway and prevent further infections. Nose provides vocal resonance to the voice. There are certain nasal reflexes which are elicited by the nasal cavity. So we will discuss all these functions one by one and talk about their important points. So, with the help of nose, we are able to perform both inspiration and expiration of air. So, during inspiration, air current passes along the mid portion of the nasal cavity, as you guys could see in this portion. It is not passing in most superior area and most inferior area. The air current passes along just the middle portion of the nasal cavity. And one thing to remember is the airflow is lamellar in nature. All right, there is no disruption, there are no eddy currents. Whereas on the contrary side, during expiration there is resistance. The resistance is due to presence of turbinates, most importantly. Okay, so the resistance of nasal valve and turbinate leads to formation of something known as the eddy currents. These eddy currents are present in the expired air, whereas the inspired air, it is completely lamellar flow. All right. Now, what is the importance of these eddy currents? So, expired air ventilates the sinuses. This is the importance of formation of eddy currents. So normally when we inspire, air passes in on towards the lungs, whereas during expiration eddy currents are produced, which leads to the filling of the sinuses, and this air is again expired out. So inspiration, the air passes completely unopposed in lamellar flow, whereas eddy currents are produced due to resistance during expiration, and thus air is filled up in sinuses. So expired air is the main reason there is ventilation of sinuses, and this is all because of resistance leading to formation of eddy currents in the winds. All right, very important concept. Now let's move ahead. Now there is something known as nasal cycle. So nasal cycle is nothing but rhythmic cyclical congestion and decongestion of nasal mucosa. So as soon as there is congestion of nasal mucosa, there is going to be nasal obstruction, and when there will be decongestion, the airflow would be maintained again. So this nasal cycle varies around 2.5 to 4 hours. Although it's highly variable in individual, but this has been taken as the average. So one nostril would be congested and the another one be decongested, and this will be repeated every 2.5 to 4 hours, and this is referred to as the nasal cycle, alternation between congestion and decongestion. Now let's talk about air conditioning, another important function of nasal cavity. So by the virtue of air conditioning, nose does three important functions. First is filtration and purification of inspired air. Then it helps in temperature control of the inspired air, and finally it humidifies the inspired air. Alright, let's talk about these one by one. So the hair cells present in the nasal cavity are referred to as the vibrissae. So these nasal vibrissae filter out the larger particles, whereas the smaller particles that of around size 0.5 to 3 micrometer are trapped by the nasal mucus layer. Alright, whereas the point to remember it is particle size less than 0.5 micrometer pass through the nasal cavity without any difficulties. Thus nasal cavity cannot capture particles of size less than 0.5 micrometer. Alright, the nasal mucus traps only particles of size 0.5 to 3 micrometer. Alright, next important function in air conditioning is temperature control. Temperature control is exclusively done by nasal mucosa, and the mechanism is known as radiator mechanism. So If the air outside is hot, it is converted into cold during the process of inspiration. And when the air outside is cold, it is maintained to a slightly higher temperature. So this is all done by nasal mucosa, and the mechanism is known as radiator mechanism of the nasal mucosa. Next is humidification of the inspired air. So again, it's a function of nasal mucosa. Nasal mucosa maintains the relative humidity of inspired air at 75%. Very important data. 75% is the normal relative humidity of inspired air after it passes through the nasal cavity. Whereas if by any cause the relative humidity of inspired air decreases, gets less than 50%, the ciliary function would stop within 10 minutes. Alright, so normally 75% relative humidity, if it gets decreased below 50%, ciliary function will stop within 10 minutes. Alright. Now, the next function of nasal cavity is the protection of the lower airway, and it is brought about by virtue of, first we have sneezing. Sneezing in itself is a protective reflex of the nasal cavity. All right. Next, we have secretion of enzymes and various immunoglobulins. Immunoglobulins like IgE, IgA, and substances like interferon are secreted into the nasal cavity. The enzyme in the nasal cavity that acts as a lysozyme is referred to as muramidase, and this muramidase enzyme kills bacteria as well as viruses. Now, next mechanism is the mucociliary mechanism of conveyor belt mechanism. This is the most important part of this whole video. Now, let's talk about the conveyor belt mechanism or the mucociliary mechanism. So, in this diagram, we guys could see ciliary epithelium, ciliated columnar epithelium with beating cilia and goblet cells secreting the serous layer. Just above the serous layer, we have the mucin layer or the mucus layer, and this combination of mucus layer and serous layer is together referred to as the mucus blanket. This mucus blanket acts as a conveyor belt and moves the trapped particle in just single direction, forward direction towards the pharynx, and the speed is around 5 to 10 millimeter per minute. That is, this mucus blanket moves in forward direction at a speed of 5 to 10 millimeter per minute, and this forward movement is brought about by nothing else but cilia. So cilia itself beats 10 to 20 times per second with the help of two strokes. First we have effective strokes, then we have something known as a recovery stroke. So effective stroke is a forward beating and recovery stroke is the relaxation of the cilia in the reverse direction. Alright, and how much nasal secretion is secreted in 24 hours? A staggering amount, that is 600 to 700 ml of secretion is produced by nasal cavity within 24 hours. Okay, so since mucus blanket is moving at a speed of 5 to 10 millimeter per minute, the mucus is cleared into the pharynx every 10 to 20 minutes. Okay, the one particle when starts from the nasal cavity, it ends towards the pharynx and moves at a speed of 5 to 10 mm per minute. It reaches the pharynx at around 10 to 20 minutes. All right, so these things have to be remembered. Okay, so you guys have seen how important cilia is in this mechanism. Without cilia, the conveyor belt of mucus blanket will not move forward in the forward direction. Therefore, if something happens to cilia, for example, a syndrome referred to as the immotile cilia syndrome, in which there is defective cilia which cannot beat effectively, and thus this conveyor belt mechanism stops, and it will lead to the stagnation of mucus, causing diseases like bronchiectasis and chronic rhinosinusitis. So nasal reflexes include, first we have the most important one, that is the smell of food. As soon as we smell food of any palatable material, there is reflex secretion of saliva and gastric juice. Saliva in the oral cavity and gastric juice in the stomach, just by the nasal reflex after smelling food. Next, we have a reflex known as the sneezing reflex. So sneezing is a protective reflex. Alright, and it is triggered due to irritation of nasal mucosa. Next, we have reflexes referred to as nasobronchial and nasopulmonary reflexes. So the basis of these reflexes is that as soon as there is nasal obstruction in the cavity, there is going to be increased pulmonary resistance, and this pulmonary resistance is reversible. That is, as soon as we remove the nasal obstruction by any medical or surgical intervention, this pulmonary resistance would automatically subside. Alright, so this was all about the nasal reflexes. Next, we have one of the most important function of nasal cavity, that is olfaction. Olfaction is brought about by the olfactory bulb and its epithelium. Alright, and any defect in the olfactory bulb would lead to disorder of smelling, and disorder of smelling include anosmia. A mean absence, therefore it is referred to as total loss of sense of smell. Hypo means reduced, therefore hyposmia means partial loss of sense of smell. Next, we have parosmia. In parosmia, there is perversion of smell. That is, the patient interprets, there is wrong interpretation of odor by the patient. And it is typically seen in the recovery phase of post-influenzal anosmia. So there is anosmia in influenza rhinitis. And just when there is a regeneration of fibers after influenza infection, these fiber gets misdirected, and therefore there is formation of parosmia. All right, and another thing important about parosmia is brain tumor should always be excluded in the cases of parosmia. So it's a dictum. We have to exclude a brain tumor in all cases of parosmia. So this was all about the functions and physiology of nose. I hope you guys like the video. Please share, subscribe and like this channel. Thank you.